Hey everyone, and welcome to the first ever episode of Pixel Mix, the pick and mix gaming podcast. I'm Andy Wood, and I'm a games developer at the University of York.
And my name is Josh Dimms, and I'm a journalist at Metro newspaper.
So, for anyone who has listened to our previous podcast, we just spent over a year trying to beat all of Xbox Game Pass for Beat the Sheet and Xbox Game Pass Challenge. Welcome to our new show. We hope you enjoy it. And for anyone new who wants to know what Pixel Mix is going to be all about, we're really seeing this as kind of a variety gaming show. We want to cover all corners of the industry, so we're going to have a variety of different episodes that go out every month. We've got our Games Club episodes, which is what today's first ever episode is. That's going to be a kind of deeper look at interesting games from the past or present of gaming. We're going to be doing Games of the Month specials, where we break down all the big games that month. We've got a retro console special every month where we're going to complete and review a game from one of the mini consoles that we've all bought and never used. And we're going to kind of rank those on a growing leaderboard to decide which is the best game from all of those retro games. And we're also going to have a ranking special every month. If anyone is here from Beat the Sheet, they'll know that we often do some incredibly messy, overly complex ranking episodes. And yeah, we're going to be bringing those to this show. Our first one will be ranking every single Nintendo franchise, which is going to be, something pretty crazy. So that's all coming up, though. So this week, we're going to be covering one of the strangest games of the PS2 and GameCube generation in Killer 7 in our first edition of the Pixel Mix Games Club. But before that, we're gonna hit the biggest gaming news of the week. And I think it's fair to say this week, Josh, the biggest story has to be this crazy situation unfolding with Abandoned, the indie game that definitely isn't Silent Hill.
Well, it says it isn't Silent Hill, but if you believe that, you're a sap. Come on, you've got to embrace the controversy. Surely it's going to be Silent Hill. They can't have ballsed it up this bad.
I think the situation is crazy. So for anyone who hasn't followed this, there is a studio called Blue Box Game Studios who insist they're an indie studio, and they insist they have nothing to do with Silent Hill or Hideo Kojima. They're just making an indie horror game that they're being particularly secretive about. And yeah, I mean, I don't know, for what it's worth, I don't actually think it has anything to do with Kojima. And I think they're in a pretty tricky situation at this point because they kind of played into it at the start. They were tweeting little teasers saying that they had something to announce about the game, and the first letter of it would be S and the final letter would be L, and really, really stoking the flames. And I don't know, I feel like they are just an indie studio who was just trying to ride a wave, get a bit of interest, which they're well within the rights to do. And they've now ended up at a point where the director of the studio is having to film himself like it's some kind of hostage video, being like, I've nothing to do with Kojima or Silent Hill. I'm just a guy trying to make a simple game. And I don't know, I think it's blown up out of any proportion at this point. But who knows? Maybe somehow this will be a Kojima deal.
I'll put the case forward for the maybe it is, even though I personally am particularly convinced that it is a Kojima side project. I hope it is, because it's the kind of stupid thing he'd do, and I'm completely into it. But for the prosecution, let's have a look at the fact that Sony have put a lot more interest onto this title than you would normally do so for just a random indie game by a studio who has made nothing. We've got a big blog post, really build it up as a PS5 exclusive. Just seems like a very odd thing to do for a niche indie studio, which hadn't even shown even a trailer yet at this point.
Yeah.
So, they've got a heck of a sales pitch, and if they do, fantastic. But that is slightly odd, as well as the fact, point number 2, we're talking what they're saying is a AAA, 4K, 60 frames, top-tier experience. And you look at the size of the team and what they say they have in-house, and it really doesn't add up. That's not enough staff to make this sort of experience. I know new consoles are getting easier to develop for, in the sense you can make bigger, better experiences. Look at Bright Memory, for example, on the Xbox Series consoles. It looks like a AAA game, just one dude. But again, it just feels a little bit odd. And third point for the prosecution, this whole it's very Kojima. He has literally done this before with the Phantom Pain in Metal Gear Solid 5. We all know he was working on a Silent Hill game, which eventually got cancelled, called PT, which also had a fake kind of reveal trailer. It was not meant to be Silent Hills until it was, right at the death. And fourthly and finally, this whole bizarre concept of a demo app thing.
Yes,
which they are apparently launching today. If you are listening to this on launch, so we know nothing of it, is ridiculously ludicrous for once again what is meant to just be a small Dutch indie studio. So a lot of weird things going on there, undeniably weird. I can see why people are thinking there's something going on here, but I don't know. I don't quite buy it myself.
Yeah, I think I would say, like, I was waiting to bring that one up. I think the weirdest thing has to be that app, that you have to get an app to see a demo of the game. It's so awkward and specific, and I just don't see a world where an indie studio would be wasting time and energy on that. You know, if you've already got a small team trying to punch above their weight with this huge experience that is, you know, usually something that would be done by maybe 10 times the amount of staff you say you have, why are you making a bespoke demoing app that people have to get to look at the game? It's crazy. Like, I gotta say, if they're not involved, they've, as much as, like, you know, I'm sure they're going to get a ton of backlash on Twitter and all that sort of stuff, they've played an absolute blinder in terms of just getting some interest and buzz around this title. You know, if they are genuinely just a small indie studio making a low budget horror game that they're going to try and like stretch graphically to their limits, then well done to them, to be honest. I would be completely fine with that. I think they've done a good job, but yeah, we'll see what happens. You know, hopefully by this time next week we'll have a bit more information on that. But yeah, anyway, moving on to other news, we have a couple of little stories here. And first of all, we are getting the first kind of bit of information through that the Xbox Cloud Gaming service is starting to be running the servers on Xbox Series X hardware, which is quite a big deal, really. It might not sound it, but basically all of the cloud gaming so far has been running on Xbox One S hardware. So anytime you stream a game, you're getting those last gen versions, and not even on a One X, you're getting One S level gameplay through the cloud streaming service. So yeah, there's people who've clearly been playing Series X versions in cloud streaming as of this week. Microsoft are not announcing it yet. They're kind of just putting out vague PR speak to say, oh, we're always looking for ways to improve the service, but we've got nothing to say about it at the moment, which, you know, fair enough. I'm sure they want to do a big reveal, but yeah, this is cool. This is really good news, you know, and it kind of gets things ready for, because there was the announcement last week, which got a bit buried amongst all the other E3 stuff. But Microsoft did come out and say that they're planning on basically setting up a system where people can use last gen consoles like the Xbox One to play Series X games through streaming. So I think that's where this is heading. You know, you get those servers ready for Series X level games, and then people can sit at home on a last gen console if they want to and play them. So it's all pretty cool. All, you know, more kind of forward thinking stuff from Microsoft.
Yeah, Microsoft continues to really push forward its vision for what gaming will be in the future. I mean, we're all waiting for technology to catch up to that, and it certainly will do in the next few years. I famously, on the past show, have bemoaned my lack of technology in my life. So, you know, these things matter not to me. But this is very much a trump card in Microsoft's back pocket for years down the line, that they've done a lot of the groundwork for where, let's be honest, gaming will probably go. It'll go to a cloud streaming kind of service. Whether I like it or not, it will eventually do that. So it's good to see them getting the hard yards in early. It'll only pay off in the future, that's for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And one final news item of the week, which is barely news, but, you know, if anyone's came here from Beat the Sheet, they'll know that we are a bunch of Sonic apologists here. Yeah, I just really wanted to plug the Sonic 30th anniversary concert, which went out on YouTube on the 23rd of June. So that's available on YouTube to watch now. We'll put the link in the show notes, because basically it was just bloody delightful, and I want more people to just go there and listen to it. It was a lovely, fantastic showcase of just awesome Sonic music, and yeah, just a big fan, Josh. Loved it.
I haven't actually listened to it yet, which may surprise you, because I am number one in the Sonic Apologist Society. I am head honcho for that. For that hog. I have apologized for that hog a lot in my life. And yeah, I have not quite got round to this yet. I'm very much looking forward to it. Happy 30th birthday to my boy Sonic. Love that guy. Sonic the Hedgehog 2. What a game. What a fantastic game. That'll crop up on the old mini consoles list at some point. So, you know, God knows when, but it will at some point crop up. So very much looking forward to talking about that. And I think we've got even bigger Sonic plans for the future. Am I right?
Yeah, we do. So we are currently in the process of making our way through as many of the Sonic games as we've kind of forgot over the years, trying to refresh our memories for them. Because in August we will be doing a ranking special where we rank every single Sonic game in order from worst to best. It's there's a lot of Sonic to cover in there, and yeah, we're working hard at it now, and yeah, it should be a lot of fun. I look forward to you arguing for almost every game to be the best game. It's going to be great.
It's going to be a very good time. I mean, at the moment, there's internal discussions at the Pixel Mix headquarters of whether we include Game Gear and handheld titles within this list. Andrew, being a gosh darned coward, wants nothing to do with it. So, by all means, new and loyal listeners, do get in touch and tell him to stop being such a wimp. And let's rank Tails' Labyrinth, Sonic's Labyrinth, and Tails' Sky Adventure. Let's get them all in there. Let's go full hog.
Well, I'm looking forward to the hate mail I'll be receiving on that one. I'm sure we will now have to cover all the Game Gear games. That was a good targeted attack, Josh. Well done. But yeah, anyway, that is the end of the news this week. So let's get straight into our big feature of the week, which again is Killer 7 for the Pixel Mix Games Club.
Okay, so first up on Games Club is Killer 7. Now, every single Games Club week, it'll be one of us who are putting forward a game. This is my pick. This is a classic GameCube PS2 game released all the way back on the 9th of June 2005, developed by Grasshopper Manufacturer and the lead designer being the irrepressible Suda51. So, as we talk about this game, we're kind of going over a few different sections. We're going to kick it off with a review, just a straight talk about how the game plays now in 2021. Does it hold up? Did Andrew like it as much as I did? Do I still like it? Because it's a very divisive game. There's no doubt about that. But beyond that, we're also going to have a broader conversation about what Killer 7 meant for the games industry. And this is going to be a running theme of Games Club. It's not just a review of one game, it's what surrounds it. So this week, we're going to be talking about Goichi Suda's influence on the industry and his madcap-eccentric ways and the fantastic titles he has left in his wake. We're going to be talking about the Capcom 5, a fabled deal between Capcom and Nintendo, which was meant to be a big boon for the GameCube and very much turned out to not be. We're going to be asking the hard-hitting question like, is Nintendo for big babies? And trying to prove that maybe they actually kind of are. And we'll talk about how this ridiculous, almost on-rails light gun-esque adventure game came to somehow be funded. Madness, I know. But let's kick it off with a talk about the game itself. Andrew, you've been playing it this week for the first time, as I understand it. How have you found it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, this was my first experience with Killer 7. I've been through this whole game over the last couple of weeks, and let me tell you, man, Killer 7 is a unique experience. Whether you played it at the time or whether you come into it 15 years later, this game is. It's kind of just, you feel like you're just having some kind of fever trip for the whole thing. It's incredibly strange. Gameplay mechanics wise, it just does stuff that I haven't seen anywhere before or since, frankly. Nobody tries to replicate what Suda does with this kind of stuff, and that's kind of cool. I think my first takeaway, though, from Killer 7 has to be that, we're coming to this, like you said, 16 years after the fact here, and we're playing it on old hardware, right? I'm playing this on a GameCube. I've got an adapter that lets me plug that into a good TV, but, it's still a low-resolution old GameCube game. And just in terms of, like, visual aesthetic to this game, it's absolutely fantastic. It's such a stylish, just confident game. Like, the only thing I can find to really compare it to is the kind of Persona 5 menus and layout of like the modern era. I just think for its time, it's just such a slick, well put together game from that standpoint. And I think that's the first thing I noticed about this. I just think it looks wonderful even today, really.
It's a stunning art style, and it just completely takes you away even now, because very few games look like it. Along with the fact that Killer 7 sometimes gets bored of its incredible art style and just goes into random anime cutscenes. It changes itself up even within its own gameplay, which is just ridiculous. I remember reading an interview fairly close to the time where Suda was speaking about what this art style meant, and people saying, well, what came first, the art style or the gameplay? And he was literally saying, I had the art style first, and we didn't know how the game was going to play. And You can kind of tell
Yeah.
in Killer 7. You could kind of tell that this was very much a story and visual spectacle first up, and the gameplay kind of comes later. But by God, it does look gorgeous. Those character designs, you play in Killer 7 as 7 different assassins, but you're technically just one assassin because it's multiple personalities from that one guy.
Yeah.
Naturally, as confusing as humanly possible, but each of these characters are so well designed. They've all got so much personality, despite the fact that really they barely say anything, and they're all doing very similar tasks.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, as you said, yeah, they barely say a thing. You get about 2 lines from each character in the whole game. You know, you get a line when you do a critical hit kind of headshot, and you get a line when you select to play as them. And that's kind of a lot. And yet still, they're all so varied, and they have so much personality just in the way they move, the way they choose to fire their guns, the way they just react in the brief cutscenes you see them in. Again, so much character, so much personality. And yeah, again, this is a GameCube game and a PS2 game. You know, I just don't feel like you were seeing kind of animations of this quality and overall visual design of this quality back then. So it's one thing that Suda has absolutely nailed here. I would say though, you kind of briefly touched on the kind of the narrative or the story constraints there behind how these 7 assassins are all inside one man's head, and they all were assassins at one point, and they died, and their souls got merged into the this old guy or whatever. Like, gotta say, Josh, I mean, I only just finished playing this week, and I don't have a bloody clue what's going on in this game. The story is absolutely wild. It's you know, for something that plays like a kind of pulpy, kind of off the wall action game, the story behind it has more in common with like a 50-minute Metal Gear Solid cutscene than anything else. It's this big escalating conflict between Japan and the USA, and the world has kind of shut itself down because there's this virus that is kind of taking over the world, and like the internet's gone and no one travels anymore. It's just this big, heavy story. But then in the middle of that, you're just playing as 7 assassins inside one man's mind. It's absolutely insane.
I mean, people will spend decades trying to pick apart this story to find a cohesive through line. And they'll be wasting their time because a lot of it is inherently ridiculous in the way that a David Lynch movie evokes mood and feel rather than anything really, you know, literal and which you could draw point to point to. You don't necessarily have to. It just sweeps you along in its mood. And Killer 7 is very much of that school. I mean, it probably makes itself more confusing because, as you say, this is a conflict between the US and Japan. It leads off on that. It makes a very big thing about that in its first couple of missions. And then it kind of just puts it to one side for 3 or 4 missions where you're just kind of doing your assassin kill of the week. And it has very little bearing on actually the main story before that comes back in right at the death. But I mean, we're barely even touching on the weird trappings of this game. You've got spirits who talk to you, who you've killed already, a guy in a gimp suit who just hands from the ceiling and will deliver tutorials to you in ridiculous dialogue. You've got preposterous boss fights against people whose literal brains are exposed. It's completely mad, but I still find it quite entertaining, and it's also deceptively deep. There's a lot of big themes going on here. It's talking about pretty heavy stuff in a very camp and over-the-top kind of way. It's impossible not to be swept along in it.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I think, you know, for all that there are issues with this game, which we will get to, particularly when we kind of zone in on the actual kind of level design and mechanics of the game. But I would say that when you're actually playing it and you're just in this world, you are engrossed by it. You don't necessarily feel that drag that, you know, I think you take the exact way this game plays and, you know, get somebody other than Suda to kind of make the trappings to go around it. And I just think it falls so flat. But as you said, yeah, you walk around these areas with all these wacky characters and, you know, crazy gimp man that comes down from the ceiling and gives you tutorials, and like heads that live in a tumble dryer and want you to close the door because it's their dryer and they love it in there. Just like absolute just nonsensical stuff. And it just works so well because there's a certain air of confidence in the way that Suda puts this game together. You know, it's kind of like you kind of just have to go along with him. You're given no choice. You know, there's just such a kind of just confidence about the way he puts his games together. So yeah, I like I said, I think it's got some real issues, but I definitely just ran straight through it, really.
I think as well, we mentioned the visual style of the game and how it looks, and it does look fantastic. But beyond that, the way it uses menus and effects to bring you into the world is absolutely wonderful as well. I mean, your assassins, you explode into like a particle of blood when you switch between characters. So really cool and effective. Every single mission starts with like a load of bullets coming into the screen, or you'll shoot a silhouette of the person you're going to kill and they explode into blood. It's filled with these stylistic little touches which just run all the way through the title in a way that only really the Persona games have done that well for me. It's a really stylish game, is Killer 7 in a lot of ways. It's very film noir, but also spaghetti western. And those two genres don't mix, and yet it kind of is that. It has a lot of that going on. It's a fascinating game to look at and to just play around in the menus of. Yeah. I mean, there's the fantastic mechanic in this where you have thin blood and thick blood. Thick blood being essentially for upgrades to your character's skill points. And you get that by going to a blood bank, and a person will just pull a lever and you'll see all the blood being converted into points essentially to convert. But occasionally you'll have too much blood and the machine will just break, and he'll hit it a couple of times with his fist and then put a closed sign on it and walk away. It's just filled with so many moments and touches that it's just a joy to discover them.
Yeah, I mean, that's even, you go to that there and how you have this blood bank, but even you could even take a step back from there and say that blood bank thing happens inside a TV that's in the save room. And when you try and access the TV, there's like a posh waiter that stands in the room and he physically turns the remote and turns the TV on to put you on the TV menu. Like, there's just so much thought put into all of these trappings. And it's just, yeah, like you said, there is only Persona that I can think of that puts this much thought into actually the UI around the game. And maybe that is, as you said, because Suda pretty much nailed this style down before he even knew what game he was going to make.
Yeah, that's probably it, let's be honest. Should we talk a little bit about the assassins you play as? Because despite the fact that you'd think they'd control quite similarly, every character is quite unique, which is quite a lot of fun. You've got 8 different people you're essentially playing as here, despite it being called Killer 7. And you've got from a cleaner called Garcian Smith, who is functionally useless, but can pick up your dead remains. If you're to fall on the battlefield, he'll just pick up your head and you'll just shove it back full of blood and you're back in the game again. A very strange way of having like a one more chance system. I don't think many other games do it this way. It's almost like Dark Souls, where you can recover what you lost.
Yeah.
But doing it 16 years earlier in this stupid way. But you've got him, you've got Dan Smith, who wields a revolver and can charge up a super power beam shot. You've got a small child who has like a submachine gun.
Yeah.
And who can crawl and fit into tight spaces. You've got so many. I mean, you've got the Kaede Smith, who is the only female assassin in the game who has essentially a sniper rifle and can burst her wrists into blood to reveal hidden areas. It's just
which makes no sense. I mean, we haven't even touched on the Mexican wrestler. There's a Mexican wrestler who upgrades with like more elaborate costumes as the game goes on, and his power is just that he can just again, years before Chris Redfield did it, Mask is there just punching boulders. He just punches straight through boulders so you can go through other areas. It's again, just so much variety in the characters and stuff. But I would say, and I think this starts to lead into kind of the issues I have from a kind of game mechanics point of view. I think, first of all, the game does an awful job of explaining any of this to you. Like, you spend your early couple of missions, you're kind of just walking around the maps, and you know that somewhere you have to do something. There's always this trigger of if there's a puzzle to be solved, it kind of plays this little guitar riff. So that's an area where something needs to be solved. But the game does not at all make it clear that all these characters have these distinct abilities. So it's like, if you go into this blind, you don't read the instruction book or you don't look online for a bit of advice before you get going, you just end up hitting a wall straight away because you have there's no logical reason why Cade or Katie's power would be that she can make a wall disappear by doing blood out of her wrists. Like, it's just a thing that happens, and it's just there. But I don't think the game makes it very clear at all. I think especially in the early going in this game, you kind of have to fight against the game to figure out what it wants from you.
Oh, the game has absolutely no intention of telling you anything at all. In fact, probably the only way to actually understand it is to spend a lot of time in the save room, in the back room with your guide buddy Izukawa, who will literally give you a giant list of commands that you can do, and you just have to read all of them. but every single command is with a line of dialogue, which you could really wish you could skip, just so you could find out what it was faster, but you can't do that because it's Killer 7, and God help you.
Yeah.
And yet, you will just hit walls. You will not know what you're doing. I mean, I didn't find out for sodding hours into the game that I could change characters on the pause menu.
Yeah.
I thought I had to do it at a TV.
Yeah,
I remember, because I played this 16 years ago, that I could actually just change character because nobody told me that I could do it.
I played literally half the game walking back to the TV room to change character. And the only reason I figured out that you could do it a different way is because I reached a puzzle that insisted on me changing character there and then. I think it's like the fourth mission in out of 6. There's something where you have to jump onto a roof that is something only one character can do. And then when you're on that roof, you then have to use the Katie's blood power. So that was it was only then that I was like, oh, you can change character. And I must have wasted about like at least an hour of my time running back to save rooms because the game just frames it. I mean, you can tell from the fact we both fell into the same trap. The game absolutely makes it seem like you have to change character at the TV room. It's insane. And then even like, you were saying earlier about how Garcian's power is basically that he can revive the other players. So if you lose one of your characters, he can go up to where they died and he can bring them back to life in the TV room. And I didn't even realize that was what he did. I just happened to pick him just at random because I felt like playing him. And then I walked over where someone had died and then that person came back. Like you just have to figure this stuff out by walking into situations, or as you said, reading a ton of really cumbersome tutorials. And I mean, that's insane. It's just crazy. You would never see a game come out now that would be this kind of obtuse with its stuff like that. It's mad.
It's completely crazy. I mean, every character has like a secondary fire mode, and they never really tell you what it is or how it's used or when it's useful. It's all to be figured out. The enemies, they'll give you a very bit of cryptic dialogue as to how to kill them. I would say on the whole, the cryptic dialogue isn't that cryptic. Yeah. It's practically just telling you what to do. But if you weren't paying attention, you would be completely flummoxed because there's no indications on the screen when you see them for the first time. You've been told it by a disembodied child 3 or 4 minutes ago. And if you forgot that, buddy, you're in trouble because you need to remember it because you can't speak to him again. You just had to listen to it at that very moment. It's an incredible thing. And yet this cumbersomeness and this confusing nature, you'd think, considering Killer 7 it's a very strange game, but it's an adventure game in many ways. Yeah. It's very point and clicky. In many ways, you'd imagine the puzzles would be very confusing. And yet they're not. They're incredibly simple. They're so simple to the point you'd have to be an actual idiot to not figure out that if you go up to a vase that needs some water, that you use the water bin to fill it up. And that's about as complicated as the puzzles get at any particular time. They're remarkably simple. It's just it's so at odds with this confusing system we created.
And that's it. I think, it's one of the ways that for me, the game really falls apart is that, you start off and you don't know what's going on. And that's really quite frustrating. And, you're kind of just clumsily figuring stuff out by walking into it. And, you're figuring out vital game mechanics like changing characters half the way through the game. But then also, I think after that frustration fades away and you kind of play the back half of this game, you very quickly realize that, visually the level design is wonderful in this game. You go to some really cool places. There's like abandoned little fake towns that aren't quite real. There's like fun fairs. There's like big restaurant places. It's all, there's some really cool stuff visually, but the actual level design in these levels is incredibly samey and tedious throughout the game. Like every level you go to is basically just walk every possible way until you find something, until you hit a wall, and then use one of the rings on the wall, whether it's like water, fire, wind, or use one of the character's powers to get past that puzzle. And as you said, it's not even a puzzle, is it? It's just literally like, it just writes exactly what you need to do. Like, oh, looks like there's something here that's on fire. Maybe if you use the water ring to put the fire out, like it's all that simple. Or like you get a time ring later on, and the only ever use of it is you'll see something and you'll get like a really obvious line of dialogue being like, oh, that looks like it used to work in the past, but now it's broken. Oh no. And then you obviously use the time ring and fix it and get the stuff. It's very disappointing that in a game that has this fantastic sense of style, this fantastic user interface, character design, personality to it all over the place, I do think actually the act of playing this game is a bit dull. I think the level design is pretty dull. The combat, particularly for standard enemies, so I guess we haven't touched on the enemies much here, but the world is full of these demons, these kind of heaven smile demons, and whenever there's one in a room, you hear the same cackle of laughter, and that's your trigger that someone's there. And then you switch into a first person camera, you find where they are, and you take them down, you shoot them. And those encounters are just so one note for the whole game. They're of no interest. The boss fights do switch it up, so I'm kind of keeping them separate. But the standard encounters are really dull. And as I said, yeah, going around these levels is just not that interesting. And I think, again, we're back to the same point here. Suda said he designed the kind of visuals and the art style before the game, and you're damn right he did.
Well, exactly. We'll touch on the combat now because it's a good time to do so. As you mentioned, the Heaven Smiles are the villains in the game. The first-person camera, you can't move when you enter that mode. So the minute you enter into an aiming mode with the gun, you can't move anymore. Essentially, it becomes like an on-screen, like almost like a light gun shooter. You can't move your character. It's stuck in place. And you have to scan the environment to find them. Now, there's two ways to kill them. You can just keep shooting them until they die, or you can shoot a very noticeable weak point, which will have them explode instantly into a gazillion bits of pixelated blood, and off you'll go again. It's fun in parts. It's quite enjoyable the first couple of times you do it because it's quite a novelty and it's quite unique. And it does grow tiresome as you go along. It's not helped by the fact that certain Smiles enemies are ridiculously simple to defeat to the point where you wouldn't struggle in a million years. And some of them you just can't kill if you tried. Like they move too fast, or the hit point is just too tiny to hit because the analog stick aiming on this is twitchy to say the least. It's not comfortable. In fact, I'd say now with a Steam version of this game available, the PC with a mouse and keyboard is probably the best way to play it because it is quite twitchy. But some enemies you just can't kill them, so you're going to take damage, you're going to be blown up. You're going to have to then traipse back through the level to pick up your head, to take it back to the room, to then go back to where you were. So it can really start to slog itself down if you get bummed out in certain areas in this game. So there are a lot of frustrations gameplay-wise with Killer 7. It's not a natural kind of game. And we've not even spoken about the fact that how you move in this game isn't with an analog stick. It's on rails. Yeah. You press A to move forward, press B to turn around, and then press A to move forward again. And you select the direction you want to go, almost like you would a point-and-click game. You just select the hallway, kitchen, whatever it is, and then you go through it and continue again. It's very cumbersome. Although I will say, in time, it becomes quite natural, which is odd to say because it is a ridiculous system. But by the time you finish playing the game, you'll kind of grow to respect it in its own way.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's one thing, that the movement system in this game is obviously so unique. And, we've talked quite a lot on our other podcast on Beat the Sheet about how kind of first-person shooters and things like that from this era are so uncomfortably dated now when you try and play them. Like we completed Black from the original Xbox for that show, and it just feels awful to control and handle because it's so old. And, old Battlefield games, old Call of Duties, they all feel rough because that style of game has been so refined over the years that it feels like you're just going too far back in time. Whereas the movement system in this game, nobody's done it again. So you're actually kind of, as you said, after you've spent maybe half an hour to an hour walking around these areas and picking your directions to move, it has a really kind of weirdly slick flow to it that I think the only reason it's there is because nobody's went further with this since 2005. But yeah, I don't hate moving around these areas. I kind of settled into a good rhythm with the movement.
It's kind of the secret to Killer 7 is that because nothing was like it before and nothing's really been like it since, it exists in its own bubble. You can compare it to nothing. You can detract it from nothing in the future. It is very much a time capsule of a video game. It's neither bad nor good. It just is what it is. And what it is ridiculous and madcap and over the top and clearly needed an editor and clearly needed far more focus on the gameplay mechanics, and it needed a couple of hours shaving off its runtime. It needed a lot doing to it, but it's also just filled with moments which will just stick with you and you'll remember. Some of the boss fights, I know you wanted to get back to them. You'll have fights where, without going too far into spoilers, you'll just have shootouts where you'll just shoot each other and see whoever shoots each other the most wins.
And you'll think the game's broken. I genuinely did in one of them because it just felt like nothing was like happening. But there you go. That was just the boss fight.
That's just what the boss fight. You'll have like Mexican standoffs with characters. You'll have 2-on-2 almost like fighting game things with a team of other freaks who turn up at one point. There's just so many unique and weird little ways they use these mechanics that it's just a lot of fun. And certain levels are just real standouts in this game. There's a level set in a casino where you have little puzzles based on like gambling, and you've got to work your way through that until you fight two businessmen who have ties, and you have to shoot his tie and then shoot his brain. It's just a ludicrous fight, but it's so unique and interesting that you just can't help but be swept along in it. That is Killer 7. It's unique, it's interesting, it's ridiculous, and at times deeply, deeply shit. But you will kind of just have to admire it for what it is.
That's exactly it. I think like I think it's a really difficult question to answer when you kind of finish playing this game and you try and think, would I recommend that people play this? Because the reaction I first jumped to is kind of like, God, no. Like I would not recommend someone played this. I think it's too awkward to get used to it. And then when you do get used to it, the level design's a bit dull and all the problems we've said so far. But then at the same time, I have a kind of another voice in my head saying, like, I kind of feel like most people should experience the heights of this game, though, the bits that are great. And like, I don't know where that leaves me. Like, am I saying maybe just watch a long play of it online, like watch someone else play it? Because I don't think you get a lot out of playing Killer 7, but I do feel like people should see this game properly. They should actually really experience what it is.
Yeah, I mean, there is a temptation to say just watch it. I don't know if it's a radically interesting game to watch, which is funny because it's not at times a radically interesting game to play. So, of course, it manages to fit somewhere in the middle. But it is something to experience. It is something to play. It's very funny. It's very well written. There's a lot of fantastic dialogue in this game. It's really hard-boiled detective kind of stuff. It's very clever. It's funny at times. It's ridiculously sexist at others. It's just chock full of everything you could possibly want from a mid-noughties game when people just said whatever the heck they wanted. It's got a lot of that going on, and it's a lot of fun to invest in that world. Would I recommend it? Probably not. I don't think people should really play this game. If you wanted to get a different Suda experience, he's got a lot of other titles which kind of capture a lot of the same flavor, but are much more fun to play. But do I think you've really enjoyed everything that a video game can offer if you haven't played Killer 7? Nah, because there is no other game like Killer 7. You will not play anything else like it. If you want to see yourself as a video game connoisseur, and God help you if you do, because then you're like us, then you kind of have to play Killer 7 because it is one of a kind.
Yeah, absolutely. I almost see a world where the best way to play this, and it might have been the way we would have played it in a different situation, would be maybe just to kind of hot seat it a bit, just maybe have like a friend over or a couple of people, and you're all experiencing the game, you're all watching it, but just pass the pad around and just kind of all play a bit of it until you get fed up and then pass it along. I think that'd work well because I just think it's the kind of game that's just great to experience and kind of riff off with someone else. It's good that we've both been able to play it to actually talk about some of this stuff, because I think if you play it on your own and have no one to like refer back to, it's just a mess of just random ideas and craziness. And so I think it's something to experience, but maybe, if it's going to be a case of you're going to have to go and like seek out an old console, or maybe you don't have a PC that you use for gaming, I wouldn't go to those extents to pick this up. But, if it ever got a remaster one day and you could pick it up on a new console, and maybe as a curiosity, I would consider jumping into it.
As to what I'd score it out of 10, I mean, that's the $1 million question. You could give it anything from a 3 to a 10, depending on how you're feeling that day. For me personally, I think it's an 8 out of 10 video game, all things considered. But if you asked me on another day, could easily be a 9 or a 10. It's an enigma, to say the least.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, tracking my thoughts as I went through this game, if I had like a curve that I could show on a graph of like where I stand at different times and stuff, I think would have been all over the shop. I probably came out of this one around about a 6. I just think it's got some really interesting ideas. But I just think there's too many issues, too many negatives to really strongly recommend it.
Let's move on, though, to talk about the wider issues around the game. And I don't know if this was your first Suda51 game, Andrew. I'm pretty certain you played Shadows of the Damned on Xbox 360. But he's very much an auteur in his own right. This wasn't his first game. By no means. He'd made adventure games before this, the Silver Case, kind of like Duology, and then Flower, Sun and Rain, which launched on the Nintendo DS.
Of all places.
Of all places, because of course it did. And Killer 7, though, was probably his big breakthrough. And from then, game series like No More Heroes and Shadows of the Damned, Lollipop Chainsaw, Killer is Dead, all came from that. So let's talk a little bit about his, gameography, I suppose you would call it, and what you make of him as a developer on the whole.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think I've never really got into Suda's work as much as I maybe would have liked to. Obviously, now played Killer 7. I did try No More Heroes when it came out, but I think in many ways it was hampered by me getting sick of the Wii rather than getting sick of his game. I really did start to grow to hate that Wii after a while, and I think I came to No More Heroes a couple of years after it came out, so I think I just missed the boat there. I did play Lollipop Chainsaw. I think Lollipop Chainsaw is a lot of fun. I think you could argue it's another similar case to Killer 7 in a way, because I think it's got a great aesthetic and a ton of personality to it, but as a game, it was very much paint by numbers hack and slash. I don't think it did a lot of particularly inventive things from that standpoint, but again, you play it and it's a game that you just don't see anyone else making, so it does have that kind of Suda stamp on it as well. So I've jumped in and around some of his work. I am definitely hoping to get more into the No More Heroes series. I do want to play the first two before the third one comes out.
Yeah, I mean, No More Heroes, a big franchise for me. Absolutely loved those games when they came out on the Wii. Does a lot of what Killer 7 does. It's very weird, it's very esoteric, but it plays a lot better. It's a very straightforward hack and slash with a lot of very fun boss fights and just basic mini games to break up the pace. But that's all you need, because the Suda style and the Suda writing and everything that comes with it is enough to carry you through even a game like Killer 7, which at times is fundamentally awful. So when you have a game which is working quite well in No More Heroes, where it actually plays pretty smoothly, you're just going to be in for a good time. And I think that's probably the logical place for most people to start. The games have been remastered on the Switch recently, so a very good place to pick them up there. You can pick them up on the PS3, but they're ludicrously expensive. So I'd say look to the Switch ports if you wanted to give them a go. I think for modern gamers, though, it's that 360 PS3 trilogy of Shadows of the Damned, Lollipop Chainsaw, Killer is Dead, where I think a lot of people appreciate his move more into the mainstream with those games. They are weird, they are oddball, but they are a lot straighter than anything he'd made before. I mean, Shadows of the Damned was published by EA of all people. It was never going to be too crazy. And although that game has some pretty weird moments, and certainly has a lot of style to it, it is at its heart just a conventional third-person shooter. You're not going to, lose too much sleep playing that. I'd say the interesting thing to know about Lollipop Chainsaw, which you mentioned, is not just that it's a Suda game, but it's actually written by James Gunn of Guardians of the Galaxy fame.
Yeah.
I mean, that's pretty bad that he started off doing a lot of this sort of stuff, and that game is actually written by him, and it's a lot of fun. It's a very funny script. It's a very funny game. It has all sorts of awkward connotations around it today's standards. I mean, even back by those standards, it was pushing the boat. But it's actually quite a lot of fun to play as a very basic hack and slash game. I'd probably recommend that one too.
Yeah, no, I think that's fair. I think, the kind of core thread I see from a lot of this stuff, and I think like from reading up a bit of stuff on Suda, reading some interviews and stuff, I think it all bears fruit from there as well. I think the key with Suda is he just makes whatever the hell he feels like making, and he doesn't necessarily, it feels like he doesn't let people get in the way of that process. And, it might not come out that he makes the best games in the world, or, his games might have holes in them and flaws in different places, but there's something incredibly pure about the way he makes games. He just does what he wanted to do, and that's it. And I think I saw an interview where they were talking to him about he made a game called Michigan Report from Hell, which was a game where you basically were a reporter, and you had like a video camera, and you had to kind of record what was happening. It was like, it had like horror vibes to it. And the interviewer was kind of really going deep on this game and was suggesting it's this really artistic vision, and it's a commentary on like voyeurism and how we don't view people in games as real people, and we don't keep their emotions the same. And Suda's response, basically, he just said, I didn't really think that deep into it. I just wanted to make an investigative reporter game. That was it. It just like whatever, man. I just want to make a game where you report, so I did it. I just think it's so direct, like that's what he wanted to do, so he did it. And he's the same with whenever you hear him talk about why he designed Travis Touchdown the way he did for No More Heroes, he always just says, I just want to make a normal guy, he's a normal guy. In the first game, he basically just wants to get laid, and that's his goal, and that's it. It's just normal guy. That's what I want to do. Like I don't know, like you could take it as him trying to be too simplistic, maybe, but I don't. I just think he just, he's like, oh, I want to do this, and then he does it, and that's kind of great.
I mean, there's a lot of people who accuse Suda51 of being quite a pretentious games developer. I've never really felt that about him. I don't think he's pretentious at all. I think he's just doing his interests. I mean, almost all of his games feature wrestling and lucha libre in some form because he's a massive wrestling fan. He worked on the Fire Pro Wrestling series way back when, and he's, was involved in the most recent version of that game. He just does his influences. He does what he wants to do. And there's something pretty cool about that. I love the fact you mentioned Michigan Report from Hell, a game I've wanted to buy for absolutely ages, but it only got like a very limited release in Europe, never released in North America, and is essentially worth about £200 to £300 now, and you can't get a copy anywhere. Yeah. So, probably going to remain a deep cut I've never played, but I would recommend his adventure games, those old story games, the Silver Case, and particularly Flower Sudden Rain, which is it's cleverly redesigned because it was initially not for the DS and then it got ported over. It cleverly uses the DS's functions in quite a fun little way, in like a Hotel Dusk kind of way, but just with a lot more weird energy going into it. There's just a lot to enjoy there. I think the only thing I'd say about Suda now is we've been on a bit of a dry spell in terms of good Suda games. I mean, he made Let It Die, which is like a Souls-like free-to-play game, which
that was rough.
Wasn't great. It was a little bit rough around the edge. The No More Heroes reboot, Travis Strikes Again, was a top-down 2D just hack and slash game, and it was fine, but it was lacking again. I mean, I'm really putting all my eggs into the hope that No More Heroes 3 will be a huge success when it launches in August on the Nintendo Switch. I'm definitely looking forward to it. But we are waiting a while. It's not been the hot streak that he was on in the mid-noughties to like early mid-10s, where we've been waiting on a big Suda game for a while.
Yeah, we very much have. And, I think it's fair to say that, because obviously that Travis Strikes Back kind of spin-off game was very much a smaller project. And I think he's came out and said a few times that the main goal with that was just to kind of put Travis back out there for people to kind of see him and remember him as a character, and kind of open the doors to getting some feedback from players on like where they'd like to see that character go next and stuff. So I think if there's any hope of Suda making a big come back with a great game, you would probably put those hopes on No More Heroes 3. I think that makes the most sense. Like, it seems like for a lot of people that's his game, at least from the kind of more modern era, that they really do cling to and see as a fantastic experience. So definitely excited for that. As I said, I've got to play the first two first, so I won't be getting to No More Heroes 3 at launch. But I tell you what, actually, I've got one more Suda story that I have to get to before we finish off, and it almost has something to do with No More Heroes 3. But really it's one of those things again where, as you said, some people call him pretentious, other people say he's just impulsive and does what he wants. So there was a conference, Reboot Develop Red in Canada, and this was back in 2019, I believe. And Suda was doing the keynote speech at it, and he was meant to be doing a talk to all these developers about reviving Travis Touchdown after like kind of such a long hiatus, and kind of what goes into trying to bring the character back, 14 years later, 12 years later, whatever it is, and going into the specifics of what that is. And so Suda came out, and he did none of that. He was also meant to show a trailer for No More Heroes 3. He didn't do that. He instead came out for 45 minutes and talked to everyone about his favorite music videos, and showed clips of all the different music videos throughout the conference. And at the end of it, he made them all watch the entire 6-minute video for Coffee and TV by Blur, which is a quite famous music video where there's a milk carton that is like exploring, and then at the end, the milk carton dies and goes to heaven. And Suda was just telling the entire crowd that he often cries at the end when the milk carton goes to heaven. And he was just waving at the screen at the end of the video when the milk carton leaves and disappears. And that was the end of his conference. That was the end of that. So there was no No More Heroes. There was no anything. He just talked about music videos, talked about music, and showed them all that video, and then went home. And I just think that's so purely Suda. Again, some people might hear that story and think, oh, it's real pretentious to, go on about all these music videos and your influences for that long. But I just think he just went, that's what I want to do, and I'm going to do it. And I just love that. I think that's great.
I think the entire argument of Suda's importance to the industry and his work, and do you count him as an auteur, or what do we place him in the pantheon of games developers? To me, the simple question is, how many games developers can you actually name? Very few. Yeah. There's very few which break through into the public consciousness. You've got your Kojimas, you've got your Miyamotos. And Suda, to me, is one of them, because you do know him, you know his work, his style is present. You can instantly pick up a Suda 51 game and go, yeah, his fingerprints are all over this. And that, to me, is the sign of a great developer. That, to me, is the sign of somebody who's doing something very much for himself and for his art. And I respect that, and I wish more people were like that. So just a wonderful, wonderful developer, and I'll always support his work, because I just think we need more people like him in the industry.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Okay, then. Well, moving on from Suda, then I guess we should go even wider to the wider scope of what was going on around the time of Killer 7's release. And the big story here had to be the Capcom 5, which is a term that, considering it all just went up in smoke and nothing happened, it's just something that everyone still remembers from the time. So, yeah, getting into this then. So basically, at the time, it's fair to say that Nintendo had struggled massively, really, to get any real support going for the GameCube. Despite being, a powerful little console, a bunch of great Nintendo exclusives, they just, the third parties weren't interested in developing for it. They were much more interested in developing for the PS2. You've also obviously got the Xbox, the first ever Xbox is coming out around this time as well. So, the third parties have got that to contend with. And Nintendo needed to try and bring these people back in. And then out of nowhere, seemingly, just at this random developer conference over in Japan, the news came out that Capcom were making 5 exclusive Nintendo GameCube games, which were going to be headlined by, of all things, Resident Evil 4, which was a groundbreaking bit of news at the time. I remember reading this when I think I was like probably about 13 at the time, and even I knew that was insane, that Resident Evil 4 was going to be exclusive to a Nintendo console. And so that was big news. That was the kind of real shot in the arm Nintendo needed for these third parties. And then it just started to slowly deteriorate and just fall in on itself. So almost immediately, Capcom came out and said, oh, we misspoke. We didn't mean to say that they were all exclusive games. Actually, only Resident Evil 4 is meant to be exclusive. So they came out and said that, which, it's a blow. It's disappointing to hear that, but at the same time, of course, Resident Evil 4 was the big game there. And then we go on a bit further, and then before Resident Evil 4 comes out on the GameCube, 2 months before it releases, Capcom say, oh, actually, we're going to put it on PS2. And that completely tanks the sales of Resident Evil 4 on GameCube, because people can buy it on the PS2. More people owned the PS2. There would have been people who would have bought a GameCube to play that game. Why would they do it now? They know it's coming elsewhere. So that fails miserably. Then you find out so to go through some of these other games, of course, there is PNO 3, which is the only game that stayed exclusive to the GameCube. It was, of course, a critical and commercial failure, so that might be why it stayed exclusive to the GameCube. Then you had Beautiful Joe, which is a fantastic kind of side-scrolling comic book-inspired brawler, really fun game. That also got announced that it was going to come to the PS2, and also got extra content and exclusive characters on the PS2 that you couldn't get on the GameCube. So again, despite being used as a way to boost GameCube support, they basically said you should really go and play it on a PS2. There was Killer 7, of course. We've talked about that at length today. That ended up coming to the PS2 on the same day as the GameCube, so there was absolutely no benefit on the GameCube side on that one. And then the final one was Dead Phoenix, which was a kind of Panzer Dragoon style rail shooter, which again was announced to be exclusive to the GameCube and got cancelled and never came out. So the result of this entire big, swell of new third-party support for Nintendo was essentially that they got a couple of games that came to the PS2 anyway, which was fairly normal at the time for other games anyway. And they got Resident Evil 4 a bit early, but it sold substantially less on the GameCube than on the PS2 because they announced it too early that it was going to come to the PS2. And just a crazy situation. Like from every side, I just feel like there was mistakes made here that just led to this all being a massive failure. I mean, there was talks like rumors after this that because Super Smash Bros. Brawl was the next Smash Bros. Game to come out after this whole debacle, and that game didn't have any, that game started to have a lot of third-party representation in it, like Solid Snake and stuff got added to it. And there was notably no Capcom characters. And the kind of industry rumor really is that after this Capcom 5 situation, Nintendo and Capcom just pretty much closed their doors to each other for like a good few years. They just did not recover from this for quite a while. And you can kind of see why, because some of these moves, man, they're just crazy. It felt like Capcom were trying to specifically burden the GameCube releases, trying to really, just shut them down.
It's an incredible story, isn't it? I mean, I actually own all the games that came out from the Capcom 5 on the GameCube, as it turns out. And if somebody was to finish Dead Phoenix now, I would also buy it for the GameCube, such as my ridiculous nature. And most of these games actually did play better on the GameCube. The GameCube was a deceptively powerful machine. And so, Killer 7 plays considerably better on GameCube than it does on PlayStation 2. Even Resident Evil 4 does. So, there was definitely a reason to own these games. PN 03 doesn't play well on any console.
No.
No, I do, of course, own it. But, it's the question to me, though, to you is, do you believe that if the Capcom 5 actually was 5 exclusive games for the GameCube and they stayed as such, could they have turned around the fortunes of what ended up being a bit of a disaster for Nintendo?
It's a really interesting one because, there was a conversation at this time that, we'll get into it a little bit more down the line, but this conversation was that, Nintendo consoles were for the younger market, they were for families, and obviously Nintendo make a bunch of world-class games, but they're all very family friendly. And, this Capcom 5 deal was really pushing, Killer 7 is one of the most mature games, in terms of like content in there. It's gory, it's bloody, it's full of all sorts of just freaky shit, full of the most 18 rated stuff you can have. Resident Evil 4, big violent horror game, Chainsaw Man chopping people's heads off. It's all going on there. So I think those two games alone really are two standouts that I think particularly obviously Resident Evil 4. But if you tell people they can't play Resident Evil 4 anywhere else and they have to buy a GameCube, and frankly as well, the GameCube was actually quite a cheap console. It released at a very cheap price. So I do think people would have jumped on the GameCube to play that game. And then, while they're there, they probably would have picked up a Killer 7, picked up a Beautiful Joe and realized it's a fantastic game. So I'm not saying it would be an absolute, world-changing situation. I do think the GameCube probably would have still stumbled across the line in this generation. But I think it would have definitely propped them up a bit. I don't think it would be as big a failure as it was.
No, absolutely. I completely think the same thing. I think the GameCube, the Capcom 5 would have made a massive difference to the GameCube's reputation amongst other third-party developers. If they'd have been proven to sell well and to shift consoles, then maybe other third parties would have looked at that and gone, actually, maybe there is a market here for these more mature experiences, as, people would deem them. But alas, it did not come to happen, though. It is a fantastic and fascinating little bit of gaming history, and it certainly would have been the biggest exclusive third-party support ever. It just comfortably would have been. I mean, the Capcom to push for one console in this way would have been a massive thing. Imagine if they did that now. Imagine if, Capcom said there's only 5 games that are only coming to Switch. That'd be a big thing, man. People would be very hyped and excited for that. So it'd have had a similar impact back then. It's very much a case of what could have been.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's really interesting as well, because obviously the GameCube did greatly struggle for third-party support. And, people over the years have always said that Nintendo just can't bring in third-party developers, right? They can't get them to come and make games for their consoles. They struggled with the N64 massively. That's a system that's propped up entirely on Nintendo's kind of first-party library, really. There's no one else there. And then, you go to the GameCube, you have a similar set of problems. But I'd kind of argue more that, as far as I can tell, third parties are incredibly fickle and they will just follow the success. So it's almost like, you look at the Wii. I mean, the Wii was a huge success and the third parties had no choice but to flock back to it. Then the Wii U comes out, it's a failure and the third parties abandon it. And now we're at the Switch. I don't even know. I think at this point, all the third parties are they're so big and so focused on just this sole direction of like push our games everywhere that sells well, that I think these days of like massive exclusive third-party games are kind of over anyway now. And I think it's just all Nintendo need to do to get third-party support is have a successful system, and that's what they've achieved now with the Switch. So yeah, it was a strange time back then, though. These things really did matter, and obviously, as well as that, the kind of big story back then, which was maybe starting to filter out by the mid 2000s, but had been a huge story for decades at that point, was this whole narrative that Nintendo were just for big, massive babies. And if you wanted to play the big grown-up games, you had to go elsewhere. And I just think, that deals like this this would have helped finally maybe finish that conversation off for good.
Let's talk big babies, talking about Nintendo. This is a dogged, this kind of conversation which just hasn't left Nintendo. Even to this day, people always associate them as the family-friendly console. Are they that? Do we just have to kind of accept that Nintendo will never be seen as a mature gaming console because those sort of experiences just don't seem to get released on them too often? Or do games like Killer 7 and the rest of the Capcom 5 as they were prove that actually there always was a market there? Just nobody's ever had the faith in it to try and achieve it. Then again, you look at the sales figures, maybe they were right not to.
Yeah, I don't even think it goes to this. Like, I know, as we said back in the day, this was always the target of attack. Whenever any company wanted to go at Nintendo, you go right back to Sega. We do what Nintendo don't. Like stuff like that kind of thing. Like, it was always the thing of, if you want to play the big cool games, you got to go somewhere else because Nintendo is just a baby console. But I think realistically, Nintendo, arguably, I don't even think you can argue, make the most consistently well-regarded first-party titles in the industry and have for decades now. And those games happen to be friendly for all audiences. So they naturally became known as this baby company because, Mario 64 can be played by anyone. But that didn't necessarily mean that Mario 64 was a game for children. It just meant that it was accessible to them, and I think that's kind of followed Nintendo through even to today. You get your games like Mario Odyssey or Luigi's Mansion, like huge games, like great games, and obviously Zelda Breath of the Wild 2 and the Zelda series. They're all incredibly friendly for any people of any age to play them. But I argue that, to get the most out of them, you do need to be a little bit older, particularly with something like Breath of the Wild. There's a lot going on there. And I think it is a game that, even though it is family friendly, is a game for older players. And I don't know, I kind of feel like with this argument starting to dry up now. I think, people seem to be like, I feel like back in the day, they tried to play it up as this thing where you'd almost get judged, right? It's like, oh, you're so uncool, you're playing that baby console. Whereas now, like, I mean, how many Switches are out in the wild? How many people have loved Zelda and Mario Odyssey and stuff? I almost feel like we finally got past this now, and it's just a case of, Nintendo make family-friendly games, but they're not necessarily a baby console. And I think that's good. I'm kind of glad that's hopefully ending. But, maybe we're just old and we don't see that conversation anymore. Maybe that's everywhere still. I don't know.
I think the elements of the conversation still exist, mainly amongst the more hardcore gaming crowd, as self-proclaimed. A lot of people will see Nintendo has a lot of accessibility options in its games. It will literally have buttons where you could play the whole level and you'll take no damage. And you will see people lose their minds over the fact that is happening. And you'll see outcries. I mean, we all remember the outcry when the Legend of Zelda Wind Waker.
Oh, yeah, the cell shaded. Yeah.
People hated it because Nintendo fans on the whole seem very self-conscious about this image, more so than perhaps actually people outside of the Nintendo fan base do. It's almost a self-fulfilling prophecy that these people feel so uncomfortable with the notion that they could be more child-focused video games, that they have to desperately hope that it's not in any way, and that's why we need Serious Link and Dark Link. Otherwise, it's too childish for me. How could you do this? Despite the fact Wind Waker is comfortably the best Zelda game by a very long way. These are just the kind of things which have cropped up. It's an interesting thing. It's very silly. I would say that anybody who says a Nintendo game is for children and are watching losers play sudden Overwatch or Call of Duty should watch somebody do a Super Mario Maker level on the hardest extremes and tell me that those people are big babies, because that is impressive skills to be able to do something like that.
Yeah, very true. And I think, the one thing that might have finally ended this conversation or started its path towards ending, now that I think about it, is, it's almost like, if maybe there's like a bully and they're jabbing away at you about something minor about yourself. And if you just lean right into it and just, fully just embrace whatever crap they're saying, then they kind of run out of ammunition for you. And I feel like Nintendo did that with the Wii, right? Like, people are like, oh, the GameCube, oh, it's so babyish. Look at the Mario games and look at Wind Waker, you made Link a cartoon character. And then they just went, yeah, here's this waggly controller while you play bowling with your family. Like, it's there you go. Most sold console of all time. One of the most best-selling games ever. Everyone's playing it. There's your grand, she's playing it. Like, they just completely just knocked down that whole argument. But there you go, whatever. It's for babies. It's for 80-year-old people. It's fine. But there you go. We're for everyone now. Screw you. And I feel like that kind of started the path towards that argument. Maybe heading out of the mainstream. I'm like, as you said, the hardcore gamer audience is always going to be there to rip into literally anything that moves. It doesn't matter what it is at this point in life. Anything will have haters. But yeah, I feel like at least at that point, the kind of media, the gaming media, seem to just be like, yep, there's Nintendo doing Nintendo things. We gotta leave them to it now because it's wildly successful.
I mean, you can't be for babies if you've literally got somebody who possibly served in World War II playing your console. I mean, there's nothing childish about the war, kids. Let me tell you. Look, this entire argument is actually just a giant lead up to our next debate in a future episode of Is Nintendo for Casual Gamers?
Oh. But yeah, so that's the end of this month's Game Club episode. So before we head out, we want to kind of announce what next month's Game Club episode will be. So, hopefully some of you guys can maybe take the time to play the game or send in any thoughts about the game to us at pixelmixpod@gmail.com. We're always happy to hear your thoughts on it. And yeah, next month we are going to be playing seminal Xbox classic title, Blinx the Time Sweeper, which is a game which I somehow never got round to, despite the fact I love mascot platforms.
Yeah, exactly. So we're going to be talking about Blinx, talking about mascot platformers in general, talking about Xbox's first foray into console gaming. It's going to be a hell of a time. Should be a fun one.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, we also have the story that Blinx the Cat was designed by the same man who designed Sonic and Dr. Eggman. So it's all going on there next month in that episode. But until then, obviously, next week, we will be having our first ever Games of the Month show on Pixel Mix. So Games of the Month, we're going to be covering all the big titles that have came out this month. So expect thoughts on Ratchet and Clank, Final Fantasy VII Intergrade, obviously the brand new Yuffie episode there, and Mario Golf Super Rush, as well as pretty much anything else of interest that we've been checking out this month. So yeah, thanks a lot for listening to this first ever episode of Pixel Mix, guys. Really appreciate you checking the show out, and we will catch you next time.
Goodbye.